you guys all had an especially spooky Halloween. Tonight, as you all know, we have Mr. Askold Melnyczuk to talk about his newest book, The Man Who Would Not Bow. I've put a link to the book via the publisher's website in the chat, and I'll publish that in a second. If I haven't done so already, I haven't. And then after I give a brief introduction to Askold, he's going to read for a little while, and then we'll move on to a Q&A for a bit, and then repeat that cycle again later in the bottom half of the hour. So Askold Melnyczuk has published 4 novels, which have variously been named a New York Times Notable, an LA Times Best Book of the Year, and an Editor's Choice by the American Library Association's book list. He has received a 3-year Lilla Wallace Reader's Digest Award, excuse me if I mispronounced that, in fiction, and the George Garrett Award from the Association of Writers and Writing Programs for his contributions to the literary community. While still an undergraduate, he founded and edited the magazine Agni. He is the editor and publisher of Aerosmith Press, which he founded in 2006, and currently he is a professor of English at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Askold to everybody. I'm sure most of you guys already know him, but Askold, go ahead and take it away, sir.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Matt. I'd like to thank you for the invitation and thank Consequence. I want to dedicate this reading and evening to the memory of its founder, George Kovac, who had been actually, in fact, a student of mine back at UMass, and a lovely soul whose passion for confronting the complexities that surround war and its consequences led to the creation of this journal. And it's precisely where George and I kind of intersected, was in talking. George himself was a Vietnam veteran, some of you will know. I was never in the military, but my parents had experienced war firsthand, and our conversations from the start really kind of centered on the aftermath of battle and the things that people kind of carry with them and the scars that they bear. And because, of course, no war ends when a peace treaty is signed. So that was sort of, anyway, so I to dedicate this evening to George, the memory of George, who passed just a year ago. Per your request, Matt, what I'm going to do is start by reading a little bit from the first story in the collection, The Man Who Would Not Bow. The first story is called Termites, and I'm going to read for the second from the second chapter, which begins in Beirut. Oh, I just want to mention, since I noticed that Chris Merrill is here, this story is actually based on a trip that I had taken to Lebanon and Syria at the invitation of a friend who at the time had been the director of the Arab Studies program at Tufts University. She had asked me to invite a number of writers to visit a war zone. This was shortly after the Israeli-Lebanese War of 2006, a very short-lived but consequential event. It was an unforgettable 5 days, was it, Chris? Something like that, yeah. And so anyway, so this is the story that grew out of it. Took me about a decade to get down. It kind of kept growing in fits and starts, and I'm going to read you just a few pages from the second section of it. And this is called Termites, Beirut. They were in the middle of a late supper when the first bomb went off. Everything stopped. Forks froze, eyes widened. Even the candle flames appeared to stand taut. "Welcome to Beirut," said their host, Dr. El-Hass, cutting short her toast without missing a beat. Wineglass in hand, she forced a smile as she surveyed the diners around the table. A linguistics professor at the American University, Dr. El-Hass used her robust physicality and oil well eyes to command a group. Her fingers worried the coral around her neck as her gaze settled on Oliver. Oliver's the kind of the central figure in the story, and he's a young journalist in the Middle East for the first time. Her name, Oliver knew, was Dolores, spelled Dolorous. His editor in New York had told him all about her. She'd been born in Paris the year after Lolita was published. Her parents had gone there to study dentistry. Someone at the registry had misspelled the name, but she liked it. It was different, and she never tried to correct it. Anyway, she was a nymphette no longer, probably never had been. Her heavy brow aimed down, drawing attention to the gold and coral necklace splayed against her skin, and a blue satin blouse, open one button too many. There was nothing sad about Dolores. She seemed to be waiting for an acknowledgement. The others, scholars, human rights workers, a UN bureaucrat, were either natives or old hands, lifers to the region. They were ready to click glasses and push on, but the explosion had pricked the balloon of conviviality. At 31, Oliver was the youngest, least credentialed member of the group. He was also hungover and jet-lagged, having landed only a couple of hours earlier, with just enough time to drop off his bags before meeting his photographer, Garth, at the hotel and hurrying off to dinner. Now he felt the energy drained from the room, replaced by that nervous awareness you feel walking through a dicey neighborhood in a strange city. Nevertheless, he gamely hoisted his glass to their host and turned back to Dr. Aziz. Conversation slowly resumed. Once more, plates were passed, heaped with bamia, okra stewed with tomatoes, onions, and spices, kibbeh, mahashi, baba ganoush, and at least half a dozen dishes Oliver couldn't identify. A fleet of half-empty bowls lined the teak side table above which hung two abstract paintings. One in particular, pastel-colored shapes interlocking against a pale yellow background, caught Oliver's attention. "That's a shouker," Aziz offered. He added, "The old girl's nearly 100 years young." They'd been talking about Baghdad, where Aziz taught literature and political science at the university. "We're a bit understaffed," he deadpanned. Now his eyes locked on a point in the middle distance, visible to him alone. He seemed fully present and totally absent. His facial expression suggested a man long afflicted with irritable bowel syndrome. Oliver found his cratered face and W.C. Fields' nose hard to look at. He had the curious sensation he was seeing himself in 20 years. Aziz had been trying to explain about the tiny termite of debt, how a hole in the pocket expanded and grew, how easily a small sum swelled into an infestation, how if you didn't swat the principal at the first nibble of interest, you were lost, for it would gnaw and it would chew until it swallowed your heart, which it would then shit out. "War is how the termites party," Aziz shrugged, patting his lips with a creased white linen napkin. In the aftershock of the explosion, Aziz's shoulders clenched. He leaned forward. 2 months earlier, Aziz whispered, his wife, who'd once sold real estate in the city's poshest neighborhoods, had been kidnapped. He hadn't heard from her since. A bodyguard drove his children to school every morning. He prayed all day he'd see them at dinner that night. The professor downed his wine. Oliver imagined how he would have reacted had it been his wife, ex-wife, before she became his ex then. It had only been about a month. His eye swept the room as though scanning for Savannah. "Why stay?" Oliver asked. "How could he leave with his wife missing?" Aziz answered. "Besides, students needed teachers. One day, even this war would end. Yes, it would. And then? Who will teach the children? We've lost one generation already, maybe more. We lose another, it'll be impossible to get back. Not that we wish to get back." Under the painting stood a bookcase stocked with volumes in 4 languages, along with a selection of American DVDs. A boxed set of The Godfather was prominently displayed. Finally, Dr. Aziz put down his fork and asked Oliver, "You are writing about refugees?" "I am," Oliver replied, passing a plate. All evening, Oliver tried to keep his host from noticing he was avoiding anything uncooked. He'd been warned, stick with the mashawi, the grilled meats. You think the bombings linked to Tripoli? Oliver asked. The day before his arrival, an extremist group seized control of a refugee camp north of Beirut. Aziz nodded. The camps are always vulnerable. Then he asked, your interest is in the Middle East? Can't really avoid it these days, Oliver replied, setting down his fork. He proceeded to tell Aziz about Fauzi, his friend from college. Born in Lebanon, Fauzi now worked as an editor for an educational publisher in New York, while his family remained in a hill town above Beirut. Fauzi's sister had been killed the previous summer by a stray missile while trying to flee the area. The two friends stayed in close touch then. When they spoke by phone, Fauzi was bitter. For years, he'd been inviting Oliver to Lebanon. It's a beautiful country, he repeated, and you should see what war looks like. So when Oliver's editor asked if he'd be interested in a story on refugees, Oliver was ready. He sipped the flat, bubbly water. Our lives are different from yours, Aziz said softly, passing Oliver a dish of skewered lamb. Oliver forked a few cubes before urging it on the Egyptian woman from the UN sitting to his left. But everything is connected. Oliver studied the room, the heavy side table, the silver, the civility of the people. To reconcile such elegance with his image of a world shredded by suicide bombers and missiles. Where were those invisible threads linking his world to this? Then it came to him. He, they, the others, they themselves were the threads. Which made who the needle? Dr. El-Haas? Possibly. She was a surgeon trying to suture a wound. Oliver couldn't, would never tell Aziz that he'd supported both wars, that this trip was a partial expiation for what his scorn had unleashed. Not his alone, obviously. Aziz was about to say something more, but was interrupted by a loud knocking. Before Dr. El-Haas could make a move, the door flew open, and a thin young man wearing a leather jacket and black dress pants rushed up to her. The way he let himself in, and her subsequent reaction, made it clear they were well acquainted. His hair was wet. Drops of rain dappled his glasses. The young man began whispering something, but she put a hand over his mouth and gestured at the others. The new arrival paused and turned to the table. Dr. Dolores El-Haas now raised her hand with its heavy silver bracelet as if to hush the room, though it was already silent. The thin young man brushed back his wet hair and began speaking in breathless Arabic. Oliver's photographer colleague, Garth, whispered a translation. He's saying the bomb went off in a department store about half a mile from here. No one was hurt. Midnight on a Sunday, safe to say this was either a warning or a provocation, not a real attack. Those took place in daylight, amid crowds. There was something operatic about the scene, the way the young man in the black leather jacket, dotted with droplets of rain, gestured as he spoke, hugging himself with his arms, then flinging them out like wings, and how the light from the chandelier bounced off his speckled glasses. Oliver felt like he was outside himself, watching a performance in which he had only a minor part, probably jet lag. When he finished, the fellow stood there, perspiring, staring at the diners as though awaiting applause. Dr. El-Haas, who was still poised beside the young man, cleared her throat. Turning to her two American guests, she said in a faint British accent, I'm sorry for this introduction to our beautiful land, but I suppose it's what you expected, so maybe I shouldn't apologize. Anyway, this is how we've been forced to live sometimes. With that, she smiled, leaned forward, and blew out the candles. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Askold. That was
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
And while you were reading, one of the things that was occurring to me was, as you introduced the piece, that, it was in Beirut and certainly ties to the themes of war and consequences thereof. And throughout the collection, certainly, while war is not at the forefront necessarily, we're not in the trenches, so to speak, literally at any rate, war and geopolitical violence is often in the background. It's almost omnipresent in a sense. Could you speak a little bit about, how war and such kind of shapes the stories or the characters in them?
Certainly. Yeah, it's a subject about which I've written in several books now, and as I suggested, it's one that I felt was unavoidable given family history, given that my own family had been refugees from war and spent 5 years in refugee camps before coming to this country. And unlike some survivors of a war, my parents were very willing to talk about the experience. And so I kind of heard a lot about it. And at the same time, I guess what um, I took away from hearing their experiences and watching the effects of their experiences on a wider kind of range of family and members of the community in which I grew up, um, I had a very clear sense that there was nothing like this experience, that this was, something that those who go through uh, are those who experience it are divided from those who don't know it in a way that's extreme and almost absolute, and that it's incredibly difficult to try to convey the intensity and the complexity and the ramifications of that experience. And so in a lot of ways, I spent a great deal of my kind of time imagining what that experience must be like, and trying to witness its effects in the lives of characters I've known or imagined. So one of the stories, and it seems to me that we in this country have been at war for as long as I can remember. When I grew up during I was born during the Korean War, followed rapidly by Vietnam. There seemed to be a brief kind of hiatus there before another series of wars and interventions brought this country into conflicts that many of us believed could have been avoided. The idea of war and its violence have pervaded my awareness. I mean, in fact, have been unavoidable. So when and yet of the experiences that I have, the wars that I've seen my country get involved in, I don't know that any were as easily avoidable as George Bush's decision to invade Iraq. That was sort of what the hell. The consequences of that war continue to unfold around us. One of the images from the early days of the Iraq War is that series of unfortunately celebrated photographs from Abu Ghraib. And one in particular that haunted me for a long time was a photograph of a woman who was standing next to a prisoner whose head was in a black hood, and she had a noose around his neck. And her name was Lindy England, and it was a kind of famous photograph that was published internationally. And I stared at that photograph and in horror, as I'm sure that many others did, and I felt somehow pulled to respond to it. It feels very tempting to stay silent about experiences that are so far from you and so far from your own kind of daily run. And when it's a powerful temptation to say, well, this is not my lane, this is not my business. And at the same time, it feels that it's very much my lane and my business. I am somehow as a citizen of this country involved and implicated in what is being done in my name. And so anyway, with that as a kind of psychological background for it became a kind of obsession with that photograph. But looking at that photograph, I realized there was really nothing to say about it. It itself was an indictment. It itself said all that needed to be said. So I didn't want to, editorialize that the photograph itself was an editorial. What I began to wonder about is how does somebody live with what they have done when what they have done seems so unforgivable? How does a torturer live with themselves, especially when what they've done has then been kind of exposed to the world and is reflected widely around them, and is now something that their neighbors is reflected even in their neighbors' eyes. And so as I kind of thought about this, I this is kind of connected to another experience I had around the same time of the start of the Iraq War. I was actually sitting at the Quaker Meeting House in Cambridge, listening to an old Tibetan teacher giving a talk. This was the day after September 11th, and this Tibetan who was a refugee who had fled along with the Dalai Lama, had fled Tibet in 1959, said on September 12th to a group of us that now what we have to do is pray for the people in the plains, the people who had flown into the Twin Towers, because they are the ones who need our help and support. And that was pretty shocking and extreme, I thought. And I remember thinking to myself, do not say this to your neighbors in Somerville, Massachusetts. This will not play well. And it took, but what it expressed, what it articulated was the kind of extreme and yet profound other vision of what life and the world kind of are and can be like. A world in which we find a way to turn the other cheek, to forgive our enemies. And that's a difficult concept to kind of wrap your mind around. It's something that people theorize about, but you rarely encounter people who managed to do it. I'd had the good fortune of meeting a number of Tibetans who had been in prison, who had been tortured, and from everything that I had seen or heard from them or about them, suggested they had really been able to transform their whatever anger or resentment they had felt against their victimizers. And that way of being proposed a way forward for all of us, a way that did not involve the kind of constant cycle of retribution and action and violence and retribution that seemed endless and seems to be the cycle in which the world has been caught up for as long as we have recorded history. I mean, this is why I think Stephen Dedalus cries out, history is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake. To which, of course, John Schwartz quipped, history is the nightmare during which I'm trying to get a good night's sleep. Anyway, the whole sort of that to return to that photograph, between recognizing the possibility, the really kind of psychological possibility for forgiveness that we actually do contain, and thinking about that photograph, I wondered about how I could write about that that torturer. And I began to imagine her family, and I forgot about. I forgot about the photograph and the person behind that photograph or in front of that camera, and entered into a story about the torturer's mother and what it's like to come to terms with what your child has done and how it is possible even then to continue to love someone who has done something. And so that was the genesis of another story. There's another story here. The title story, The Man Who Would Not Bow, is a kind of 30-page story about the Russian Revolution and all that follows. And it too is an attempt to reflect and meditate on the consequence of extreme decisions and extreme actions, and how those decisions and those choices play out across generations. It traces a character who is involved in the kidnapping and ultimately the execution of the Tsar and Tsarina, the Romanovs, and then sort of follows what happens to them on their journey over the next several decades. So, war kind of keeps coming up and is inescapable, and yeah, that's how it got there.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I appreciate, some of the ideas that you were talking about there, especially, the kind of experience that, for those of us who haven't been, directly involved in combat, how we can kind of understand some of the things. And I think, one of the stories that you were just talking about there, the walk with us, the mother who was dealing with the daughter, who was being accused of war crimes. I think that was one of the more powerful stories for me, simply because the way that it was written, it almost felt like you were in the mother's head and you were kind of experiencing what she was going through, and almost talking to her daughter, kind of an inner dialogue. So there was a real connectivity there, and I think that really kind of highlighted for me anyways, this idea of trying to experience what is almost ineffable unless you've actually been there. And I want to take a quick pause here just to say that if anybody has a question, please, you can go ahead and type it in the chat box and send it to everyone, or just send it to me if you're afraid that you might misspell something and be embarrassed about it. Or you can there's a little hand icon. For those of you who are familiar with Zoom, you can go ahead and raise your hand like we're in school, and we'll call on you and you can ask Askold a question that way. And I guess that's a kind of a good transition, the kind of the fictive world and the non-fictive world that plays so predominantly, I think, in the text, in that because almost every story there's either an allusion to, I see Mark has a question, so I will hold my question. Mark, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Well, first a comment. I was just thinking about your description of the September 12th encounter with your Buddhist friend, and I thought of the killings in the South, in the church, where that young man, I can't remember exactly where it was, the young man went in and shot a majority of the congregation, and the survivors forgave him. The Black Baptist, this is also
Sure.
kind of a tradition of in the Black Baptist tradition, and I was very moved by that. And so there's a kind of a Christian and Buddhist commonality in religion there. But I guess the other, I think, Askold, you're really, I think, unusual, in the American, contemporary fiction spectrum, in the subjects you address. I mean, maybe Russell Banks will touch on some similar subjects, and you might know of others that I don't know. But there's so much navel gazing in American literature, and this kind of international perspective is something really I find really welcome
Thank you.
and really important, in your work. And then, of course, I love the very clear Eastern European literary tradition that's really behind so much of what you write. And of course, the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Poles, et cetera, are very much very politically conscious in a similar way. The writers and bring all those issues into their work, and I find that really refreshing. In your writing, it's just I don't encounter it very often in American literature. So.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, it is one of those things that well, that part of Eastern Europe in particular, as I'm sure you know, Timothy Snyder has labeled the Bloodlands. I think that there was something like 20 million people murdered between the Holocaust and the Gulag in that area in the course of some 15 or 20 years. And in a way, you kind of can't help but be political and or be aware of these events, and one wishes one could be. One sort of wishes that one could, have the sort of be comfortable in a kind of Mallarmean fantasy of dwelling in the pure realm of language alone. And I have to say that, in a kind of, I do admire those writers who simply decide that they're not going to confront the events around them because there's something so shameful and obvious about these things, and there is something admirable about just sort of turning your back on it and saying no, in a way that I sort of admire, and somehow reminds me of Daniel Berrigan turning his back on the judges before whom he stood, even as they was being sentenced to prison for his anti-war work. There's something moving about that kind of profound rejection of the madness that others get us caught up in. You know what I mean?
I mean, I guess I do. I mean, I'm not persuaded that it's such a conscious effort or just a kind of
well,
a narrow vision. But I won't comment on that. But the other thing I think I'm trying to think of, who are the American writers who address such subjects, and largely they're immigrant, they're immigrant writers or second or third generation immigrant writers whose families were displaced by war. Who like who have that awareness. That's just a comment, but
yeah,
I think, and also veterans. I mean, I think
yes,
the
veterans.
Obviously, their lives were deeply impacted, and those who have become writers, as consequence, has really championed, clearly, address those issues.
Well, I think thanks, Mark. The other thing I would say, though, in a way to take back maybe some of what I'd said earlier, and that is that what the experience of the inheritance of war, and also I imagine it's the experience of war that veterans carry with them, I think makes it almost an imperative that you articulate whatever you can articulate to others about the decisions that we make along the way that lead us into these blind alleys. That seems to me the reason for staying politically engaged and not turning away, because we are always we are kind of collectively responsible for our national karma and the things that we allow to happen without putting our shoulders to the wheel to try to turn the wheel in another direction. Then if we turn away from the dangers in which this democracy finds itself today, we will live with the consequences of our turning away. Anyway, that's all.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Mark. How about we get Matthew has a question, and then maybe after Matthew's question, we can have Askold read a little bit more if he's open to that.
Sure.
Make my
Thanks.
question short because I'm looking forward to hearing Askold read. Askold, when I was listening to your passage, there was a part that really drew me in, and it was the moment where the young man came in, and the hostess raised her arm, and she silenced the already silent people, and his hair was wet, and then he spoke. And I want to fast forward for a moment and then come back to my question, or reverse for a moment. So the writer, the self-described Little Russian or Ukrainian writer, Anton Chekhov, was often accused of having no plot in his theater, that the characters came in as live as they left, and not much happened in the middle to change those lives, which were inevitably to be the same after they left as when they came in. I expected the young man to announce or do something which was going to propel me forward in action, and instead he just reported on a distant event. And I'm wondering if you can comment on your own writing, and in these paragraphs, and in these stories, and in The Man Who Would Not Bow, your sense of the role of action.
I'm sorry, Matt, do you mean action in within a story, or action in the world as it's inspired by literature?
I mean, within the story, does someone need to get shot, or
I hope not. No, you know, surely some of the most beautiful stories are ones in which just the opposite happens. That nobody gets shot, and people simply stand quietly and reflect. I don't. You know, fiction is so rich in its possibilities, and the idea of a character merely, well, here, one of my favorite novels is Samuel Beckett's The Unnamable. It is narrated by a head in a jar that goes nowhere, and all it does is just talk and talk and talk to you. And yet I would say that one of the most beautiful sentences in the English language comes from that story, and it goes, I, of whom I know nothing, I know my eyes are open because of the tears that pour from them unceasingly. And that, to me, is a profound action. That, you know, that is a kind of an action inward. So, you know, in some ways, one of the easiest ways of propelling readers forward is to have your characters, you know, move across the page and kind of go somewhere. But if there is not a kind of comparable attention to the internal dimension of their lives, then their you know, gestures are those of puppets. And so I think that you know, striking a balance is probably the most kind of commonplace aesthetic approach that fiction writers take. You know, there's a kind of a certain internal dimension to their characters, and then they're all kind of on a trajectory somewhere. But you know, that's not the end of the story anyway, Matt. The characters do go on to act, and they do go on to do things that are connected to that moment when the young man tried to explain what had happened, and in a way diffuse some of their fears.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matthew. Appreciate that. Askold, would you like to read a little bit more?
I'm happy to read, in part inspired by Matt's questions, so that you can see that the kind of action continues after that moment. So if you don't mind, I'll just read the next couple of pages of that same story.
Please do.
So the next section is called, is titled The Americans. And, oh, sorry, there's one more thing I did want to say. and that's also because Matthew had mentioned Chekhov. There's a Chekhov also says something that is a kind of literary credo to which I subscribe. After reading Zola's J'accuse, Chekhov responded to the Dreyfus affair somewhat differently than the way Zola did. While he sided with Dreyfus against the anti-Semites, Chekhov said that in any case, it didn't matter whether Dreyfus was guilty or innocent, because, and I quote now, "It is not the business of writers to accuse or prosecute, but to take the part of guilty men once they have been condemned and are undergoing punishment." And that to me, seems like worthy work to be, the defense attorneys. So, okay. This is section 3 in Termites and titled The Americans. The cab raced down Beirut's empty streets, which spread like a network of nerves through the heart of the city. A light rain pelted the windshield. "She's impressive," Oliver said to Garth, who was staring out the window. Garth is the photographer, Oliver is the journalist. "Dolores?" "In her own way, I suppose," he answered. Oliver imagined him arching his brows before turning back to the window. "Don't they have street lamps?" Oliver said, probing the dark for signs of life. Disoriented, Oliver worried they were circling the same neighborhood. Gradually, concern was displaced by exhilaration. He felt fully present in his body in a way he so rarely was anymore, which was what he wanted, to be taken out of his head. "You know where we are?" he asked Garth. Garth turned to the window. "That's the old Holiday Inn," he pointed, "a hideout for snipers during the war." "Aren't we on the wrong side of the Green Line?" Oliver asked. "Isn't that the Hezbollah encampment over there?" Thousands of armed men surrounded the Grand Soleil, headquarters of the Lebanese prime minister, protesting the government. From a distance, Oliver could see tents and people moving among them. Garth shrugged. "It's a city that never sleeps." A few blocks later, they wound through a square of boutiques of the sort you'd expect to find on the Rue de Rivoli or Fifth Avenue. Brightly lit picture windows featured mannequins stylishly coiffed, flouting the latest fashions. Oliver watched the German shepherd squatting in the doorway of a Hermes store. "Reminds me," Garth said, "watch out for the landmines. The Lebanese just don't scoop." It was after 2 a.m. by the time they pulled up to their hotel. The Bristol lobby was empty. Oliver and Garth, who'd known each other casually from overlapping circles in New York, bellied up to the bar for a nightcap. 2 Jamesons on the rocks promptly appeared on the gleaming mahogany counter. Oliver swirled the liquid. "You're going to call Cheryl?" he asked Garth. Beirut must seem like Detroit after Kabul. Oliver had seen Garth's photographs from Afghanistan. But what did a picture really show? Shape and texture. The inner architecture of things remained invisible. Garth emptied his glass. "Give me Kabul over Detroit any day." Then he added, "Didn't know this was your beat. What brings you to my world?" Oliver wasn't offended, but was it that obvious? Why was everyone inquiring about his motives? Wasn't it bad enough he'd latched onto a profession lurching toward extinction, threatening to leave him without prospects at the ripe age of 31? Over the last few years, as paper after paper folded or downsized, Oliver had also begun teaching at the new school. The pay was shit, but to his surprise, he liked the classroom. He was good, theatrical, funny, confident even. But when this opportunity for field work came his way, he leapt at it. Oliver told Garth about Fauzi, whose family had been on the receiving end of the last war. Oliver had called Fauzi's aunt right after landing. They'd set up a time to meet the next day. And Syria? Garth's heading to Syria after Lebanon. And Syria? Garth asked, rattling the ice in his glass. Syria had been his editor's suggestion. It was much in the news. As long as he was in the neighborhood, he should check on the influx of Iraqi refugees pouring across the border, carrying nothing more than a suitcase. "He's right, you should," Garth nodded. "Wake up, dude. You're about to visit the oldest fucking city on the planet. There's nothing it hasn't seen. I mean, King David conquered it, Nebuchadnezzar made it kneel, Alexander the Great, Caesar, the Kurds, the Mongols, Tamerlane, the Turks, Napoleon. These people have seen it all, and now they'll get to see you." Lucky them. Oliver studied the older man's nose ring, the forearms tattooed with what looked like a comic strip, a head shaved down to his pumpkin-shaped orange-tinged skull. Know what else, dude? Nobody's going to give a shit. I mean, yeah, there are people who give humanitarian awards and the like. They'll pat you on the back, throw you some dollars, maybe a Pulitzer if you do something truly crazy. But it's not like anyone who matters will listen. Bombs will still drop, because those decisions happen in another wing entirely, and the two don't speak to each other. Thanks for the lesson, Oliver chided, but Garth was just getting going. He raised a glass in a propitiatory gesture. And those other guys, the deciders? They salt their omelets with the tears of the tortured. Garth emptied his glass and pushed it across the bar. And thank you for your service, he said to the bartender. So if nothing you do changes anything, Oliver sounded like one of his own students. Why risk your ass for a picture, for a fucking byline? Because I hate pictures, Garth shrugged, as though he said the most obvious thing in the world. His lips widened and contracted in a fleeting grin. What? I became a photographer because I hate looking at pictures. He locked his eyes on Oliver. No kidding. As far as I'm concerned, all photographs are porn. I hate the way they flatten everything. I hate the way so-called artists manipulate the material. Worst of all, I hate the way people believe they know something after seeing a picture. I don't want to be one of those guys who saw the picture and believed he knew what really happened. And the only way to do that was to be the guy who took that picture after seeing what really happened. He drained his glass and set it down with a nod to the bartender, who was relieving his boredom by stacking coasters into squat turrets crowned with shot glasses. Oliver laughed. Love it. Makes sense to me, brother. Just then, another explosion rankled the glasses along the bar. It was nearly 3 a.m. The bartender cursed in Arabic. The desk clerk, sleek and silver-vested, came around the corner to stare at the television. Less than a minute after the blast, the cameras were showing broken windows and men in shadows covering their eyes. Another department store. Some disgruntled customer. Oliver was glad for the distraction. Where is it? Garth asked the bartender. Rue Hamra, north. Let's go, he said to Oliver, who hesitated, pushing up his glasses. Okay, the men set off. Outside, the warm air buzzed with cars, sirens, and voices. They followed a group of men running up the block. A crowd surrounded a store whose window had been blown out. The strobe of lights from police cars disoriented Oliver, who stood to the side while Garth pushed his way up front, camera in hand. Oliver listened to raised voices speaking Arabic, French, English. A group of men at the edge of the crowd screamed at each other, but Oliver was too far to hear what they were saying. A boy on a bicycle rode up and down the street. Shards of glass glittered along the pavement. Hope you got some good pictures, he said to Garth as the two headed back to the hotel. Garth wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. Who knows? There were no casualties, yet the second bombing of the night led the international news anyway. Oliver thought of his mother, Yulia, whose stories about her war suddenly felt less abstract. She seemed so cheerful when she told him she was marrying again. Four's a charm, she said, almost wistfully. Back in his room, he stripped to his shorts and stretched out on the bed. He wondered what Savannah was doing. He reflected on her litany of complaints against him, that he was more absent than present, that he needed to find a full-time job. Well, yeah. Was he that different from the person he'd been 3 years earlier when they moved in together? He remembered the evening after the second miscarriage, how they held each other, and through their sobs promised they would try again, and if that didn't work, they would adopt. But plans change. He wished he still smoked. Instead, he listened to blood breaking in waves inside him, epinephrine surges. In time, he'd acclimate to the pressures of sea level in Lebanon. Hormones triggered by fear floated through the air like low-lying clouds. It was what men like Garth craved, the extra oxygen in the casino. Oliver had studied the matter minutely, biosynthesis, oxidation, methylation, dopamine. He rose and turned the air conditioner to high. He'd supported the Iraq war without ever having seen the enemy. It seemed the right call at the time to be on the winning side for once, finally a player in the game, not always kibitzing from the sidelines, to reshape facts on the ground. Then the war turned plural and nobody seemed to have won. He'd come here to see what he couldn't back home, make the distant dimensional. Maybe that way he'd understand more of the world Fauzi, as well as his own mother for that matter, carried inside them like a Rosetta Stone. Everything they did, whatever happened to them, they ascribed to one cause, toujours la guerre. The air conditioner rattled. He couldn't sleep anyway. Peering behind the curtain, he saw the sky starting to whiten. He turned on his laptop and scanned the Guardian's homepage. Then he opened a file and made some notes. He'd been lucky to get the assignment. He had to get the story right. And I'll stop there.
Yes, it's wonderful. Thank you very much, Askold. As you were reading there, I was certainly, hearing and being reminded of the other stories in the collection, of just the kind of interweaving that you do between the kind of fictive world and the non-fictive world, right? Bringing in actual events, actual people, and which is just a bit of a segue into the next question, which comes from Tony Schwalm, which is, do you think fiction can play a role in bringing these hyper-partisan states back to being united? Or might it require another 9/11 attack, which to me seems to be the last time this country behaved as united, says Tony. So yeah, that kind of connection between, what power of fiction, the power of language, and especially as it has over, possibly, a more cohesive union, so to speak. So I guess what say ye? Yeah.
No, it's a great question, Tony. And don't we wish, right? I suppose it's a conversation I love to engage everybody in, because I know that there are other fiction writers here, and I see that Ruth Mukwana is here, and I know that she has been doing a whole series of conversations with writers about their hopes for what their fiction might do. I do think that all of us write with the hopes of affecting reality and of making some kind of a difference. And I don't know that there is any other kind of convincing empirical fallback that we have beyond saying that what we do and who we are has been shaped by our own experience of reading. The reason that I was suspicious of the call to arms time and time again had to do with having read as a kid, everybody from Hermann Hesse to Thomas Mann to Tolstoy. I mean, their witnessing of war and all that follows, their articulation of the horror and the trauma, I felt palpably. And what I felt they were trying to do was to counsel us to turn in another direction and to make different choices. So, it worked in one case. Tony, will it spread? Will the people who make those decisions, those people in the back rooms who drink the tears of the tortured for breakfast, will they sit down with War and Peace and wrestle with its implications? Esperiamo, right? But at the same time, there will be some who have been brought to an awareness of alternatives and other possibilities because of poems, because of stories. And I see that Chris Merrill has put into the chat a sentence that kind of gives me a way out, or a kind of an answer. And the note says that apropos of Chekhov's retort to Zola, the last sentence of St. John Pierce's Nobel's address, and it is enough for the poet to be the guilty conscience of his time. And I suppose that is, all that I have is a voice to undo the folded lie. It's what one can do as an individual. And if there are enough individuals gathered in its name, then we become a collective, and that collective has some force and has some power. And in fact, if we can incite others to recognize that they have considerably more power than they might perhaps feel then nothing is preordained. Our awareness of our possibility and the great power we do have individually, as individuals, when we reach out and act collectively, seems to me to give us great alternatives. It's true now, Tony, I think, in this very moment where our nation is more divided than ever. And I know that there are some who fear this could descend into something much darker and much worse. That is a possibility, of course, but it is not an inevitability. And I think that anything that strengthens and encourages us and reminds us of another way is doing something. And, at this moment, it's better to do something than nothing. That's about as hopeful as I can get. I don't know, Tony, what do you say? What is your experience?
I would agree. I think the idea that we have, let's see what my video looks like. I don't have a lot of light where I'm sitting. I think you're spot on. I guess the other thing I would offer, without chasing rabbits too far afield right now, is that anything that we write, or anything that great writers write, or any writers write, that is effectively listened and heard by its audience, that pushes us towards peace. There's a death of 1,000 cuts. Maybe it's peace, by 1,000 Band-Aids. And
well said.
I just think that we have, it's a very dark space for me right now. I have a lot of friends, that didn't come back from Iraq and Afghanistan. And I have a lot of friends that came back from Iraq and Afghanistan. I have 3 friends who, committed suicide. And to see the events at the end of August of this year, it makes Saigon 75 look like a good idea. It's like, couldn't we have done it as well as we did it in Saigon? Is almost, the line.
Right.
And I think to sort of shut this down, from my perspective, is that I think anything that people who are writing as well as you and others, that can push us towards, a thoughtful contemplation of what it means to break things and kill people, as some sense of a solution.
Is there, Tony, given that you have had these experiences and you have been in war directly and in these kind of extreme circumstances, and given the kind of the terrible things that have happened to your friends, fellow soldiers, what else do you think we could be doing?
I truly think that we need to create our own echo chamber, just like you're doing. I mean, like the works that, that I see coming from, the people who are trying not to make money off of the war or off of the idea of war, and rather, to talk to, it's really nice to be at peace. It's really nice to, to go on a date or to drink coffee, all those scenes of sitting in a cafe and things like that. It's like, well, you don't do that if you're waiting for the glass to blow out behind you. You don't do that if you're waiting for a drive-by. And it doesn't have to be a war zone like Lebanon or Kabul. Or, I mean, you can come back to, Chicago or Atlanta, here in Tampa. All of these places. So I just think that we have to create our own echo chamber. And I think your work goes a long way. It doesn't have to be this explicit billboard of, hey, let's not kill everybody. It's just this idea that, let's consider more important things. Let's consider, what is it like to create a future for the, for the next generation, that, they're not, walking around with, blood-soaked shoes. And so I'll stop it there. But thank you so much for all that you've said and all that you've written. And I'm a great admirer of the work.
Yeah, well, same Tony, thank you very much for your testimony and for all that you do to um, bring a first person kind of perspective and account and to show us that there is value in peace. And I think that's what you're holding up, that there is, that it's the thing that we take for granted, that we get so antsy in and can all too easily shatter. So thank you.
Yeah, we have a question from Leslie next. Leslie, if you want to unmute yourself, you please do.
Hi, Askold.
Hey, Leslie, nice to see you.
Yeah, I'm interested in the question of empathy and what you brought up about, and someone else already mentioned about praying for the man on the plane, or you seem to infer that something about getting into the being of the torturer in one of your stories. I haven't read it yet. I'm looking forward to reading it. I've ordered it, or I'm about to order it. Let's put it that way. I'm about to order it. You're gonna let us order it, right?
Let's get yeah.
You'll let us order it after this event. Anyway, so but that kind of what really intrigues me, because I know people are talking about war and kind of these in a big way, but I'm really interested in sort of going down into the profundity of the internal being, and cutting through, getting through boundaries like that to, be the torturer, be the man on the plane. And you mentioned about, the defense attorney, or the public defender rather. So I'm just wondering, is that what some of what you've done? Is that some of what fascinates you and that you've done in this book?
I'll let you decide what I've done in the book, but it certainly is what fascinates me is the way in which reading enlarges our capacity to understand others' experiences and others' feelings, and to, any good book kind of enlarges us, and it in fact, there's actually a wonderful study, a wonderful book called Proust and the Squid, which looks at the relationship between reading and its ability to cultivate our empathic powers. It certainly does do that, and I think the imagination does that. I think that is what is that's the unheralded or unstudied sort of part of our kind of mind and our consciousness. The imagination. We talk about it very kind of casually and glibly most of the time, but what the hell is it? Where does it come from? What does it? How is it we can put together other possibilities beyond what our eyes behold? I read this rather wonderful and kind of exhilarating thing in a book of potted physics by John Grebe, I think is his name. I think it's called like 6 Impossible Things Before Breakfast, something like that. And I was talking to a physicist about it today. In it, he says something really kind of startling. He says that according to quantum mechanics, quantum physics, to the multi-world interpretation of it, because he goes over 6 different sort of ways of potentially interpreting Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, and he says that great fiction, in fact, is not made up, but that it reflects a world that actually exists. And he makes a really interesting distinction. He says, so this is not true for Harry Potter, but it is true for Wuthering Heights. And I don't know who decides what work is powerful or strong enough to merit that.
Harry Potter is definitely a real, it's one of the continuum, one of the
right. But how startling that is, that suggests that the imagination is in fact an organ that is channeling something rather than simply kind of manipulating kind of data or bits and pieces, and that's exhilarating to consider, and that sort of goes almost beyond empathy into something else.
Well, really, I was just thinking how much it takes to go into that person. I've always been kind of blown away by the parent the parent who forgives the murder of their child. To me, that just takes my breath away.
Sure,
And
sure,
I just
sure.
don't know if I could do it, but I could try to do it in my fiction, you know. And so I just wondering if you had either in this book or at all, you know, taken upon yourself to do something like that. Like,
Well, yes, that is that one story. That's that story's goal, to try to understand how she is able to forgive her daughter and herself.
Mhm.
And I won't tell you how that ends.
No, but, don't give it away. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. And we have
Thank
one
you.
more question from Virko. Virko, you want to unmute yourself?
My apologies, Askold. I came in a little late to this wonderful conversation. I want to get back a little bit to the idea of what any writer, creative artist, musician, painter, in what way influences can be made. And I see it's essentially a political problem more than anything else. And that, I mean, is the success of a writer that can actually affect things in a way, let's say, that Zola's Syracuse did, was that the zeitgeist has to be responsive. In other words, it has to go out and a lot of people have to talk about it. It's not possible for a small group, for instance, like us, to have that much of an effect. On the other hand, I think great writing can have a huge effect, but there's also, you know, there's always this if number one is the accumulation of knowledge, not only accumulation of knowledge, but accumulation of ideas about a good life. Because basically philosophy is what? Philosophy, according to Aristotle and Plato, wasn't about just thinking things up, but it was how to be good, how to live a good life. It has to be taught consequently, so that a person, by the time they reach a certain age, let's say like me, 83, I'm just beginning to understand it. And that was achieved by the fact that I tried to go through the literature as much as possible, obviously, literature of the world, and profit from the various bits of information that became significant for me to change my views. And to change views, they happen two ways, either with a sword, with inner conviction. And the inner conviction, the only one who can do it to me is me. Okay, nobody else can do it. This whole idea, I can convert somebody, excuse my French, it's bullshit. You can't. What you can do is you can give them certain information, and that information may trigger them for one reason or another, which we don't know whether it's going to work or not. It's like Schrodinger's cat. It's either alive or dead. But it's one of the two. It's not maybe. It either will work or it will not work. So I think writers, creators anyway, don't really need to worry about that unless they have the ability and they can seize the moment, like Zola had done and other writers have done. You know, I remember the effect of John Hershey's big article in the New Yorker on Hiroshima made a tremendous effect on people. So I think once we begin to correlate these things, we begin to understand and try to understand as we live which of these functions we're capable of having an impact on. And one of them may be much, much later, post-mortem, so to speak. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I just think it's a question of knowing what it is that you are capable of giving to the world and understanding that and not cheating, not compromising. That's all.
Sure. Yeah, no, of course, I agree. I mean, change must come from within, and then, you know, you're distinguishing between teaching information and you know, how do you teach wisdom? How do you acquire wisdom? Where do you go? It's that there aren't too many courses in that, but certainly not at the elementary school level, and I don't see why it shouldn't begin there. and never end, because that's, that's the lifelong learning education that we're all kind of pursuing. Right, Ellie? I see you there.
I just think that there are writers who can make a public statement very effectively.
Yes, I totally agree, and there are many who
The
have.
problem with that is there are writers who can make a very public statement very effectively and do it not for the good, but for somebody's, including their own pocket.
Absolutely, motivation is key. Motivation is key.
We should remember when we deal about wars, is there are more rich people formed during the time of war than any other time.
Absolutely, those who provide the boots and the guns, both of those.
And it's to their advantage to promote it.
Yes, they're my neighbors in Massachusetts at Raytheon, who want to partner with many universities so that they have a cadre of employees to enter into their workforce. Absolutely, and they're behind the scenes, and war profiteers are sure that's about as evil as you get.
Yeah, and then we have the one thing we have now is this public media, whether it's TVs, radio, Facebook, Instagram, whatsoever. When was the last time anybody here has seen Noam Chomsky on any television interview? He's forbidden to appear. Nobody will invite him because he does not say what they want him to say. And whether you agree with him or not is another matter. Question is there free dialogue in this country? No, there isn't, not publicly. There's no public free dialogue.
It's true that Henry Kissinger still pops up as a talking head, which is kind of a walking nightmare. I suppose that would have been a mask to wear on Halloween. And you're right that Noam does not appear on the Sunday morning talk shows. You're right.
I just think that it's perhaps us as writers of different kind is to also celebrate the writers that do say things are successful publicly of fighting bad ideas. And so that we don't get locked into this little igloo of our own, that we're the sensitive ones and that's it. There's all kinds of ways that we have to create the illusion of a real community. And it works on so many different levels that it isn't only on one level. They all have to be. I remember talking, sorry.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I remember talking with my father back in the 60s. And of course, obviously you don't know, but I'm of Ukrainian descent. We were talking about when will Ukraine even have a chance of having independence? And he said, only when the majority wants it. Time prior to this, there was no majority. It was a minority. The last time, the majority was about close to 80%. That's why it happened. There are just certain things that I think has to be seen in context of a collective working. And that collective is something that we need to understand, that we need to permeate the whole social structure. So to use the New York lingo, downtown, midtown, uptown. Has to be infected. The women or the drug or whatever has to travel that way before change is really possible. And I'll never forget when Eleanor Roosevelt went to her husband and said, "We got to stop, the lynching laws in the South." And he says, "I know, but without the South, I can't pass this," which was, of course, the social revolution at that time, the FDRs.
Right.
And politically, he's right.
Well, and that's exactly why forums like Consequence exist, and to spread the word and to gather communities together. Right. And so I thank you all for gathering here tonight.
Yes. Yeah. I really appreciate you taking the time, Askold, to come and read and engage in these conversations. Because I wholeheartedly agree that these conversations are exactly the reason why consequence is around in doing the work that we do.